One early summer morning in 2006, I was on a train on my way to meet some modern-day slaves. As you may well know, according to the World International Labor Organization, there are 27 million slaves in the world today. They labor as brick makers, coffee harvesters, cigarette rollers, and domestic servants. They are not free to leave. If they try, they are prevented, usually with violence. Millions of them are serially raped in brothels, some of them as young as 9 years old. And even those not enslaved in the sex industry itself are liable to be sexually exploited at the whim of their masters. They're paid nothing beyond the barest amount for their subsistence. And often their pay is ostensibly to pay off debt incurred by themselves or their parents. But in fact, they labor under onerous interest rates that ensure that their debt will never be discharged. This particular train was departing from the incredibly busy train station by my Amtrak-shaped standards in the city of Chennai in southeastern India. And I had come to southeastern India, to Chennai, to meet this man, Jaikumar Christian. Jaikumar is the head of the International Humanitarian and Development Organization World Vision in India. Supervises 8,000 employees doing relief and development work in that country. And I, as a journalist, had asked for a few hours of his time for an interview, assuming we would just meet at his office. But a few days before I was to get to Chennai, he emailed me and he said, plan to get on a train. I need to go to Gutiyatam and I want you to come with me. So Gutiyatam is a district about 2 hours west of Chennai. And in this particular district of small villages, rural, agricultural India, in all its beauty and all its difficulty, in this district, 9 years before our visit, child slavery had been rampant, endemic in every village in the community. There was one village of about 200 people called Kalangiam. And the Kalangiam Women's Federation had compiled a list of elementary school children who had been enslaved. So this was their list, 20 children in a village of maybe 200 people. So Prabhu, for a bondage amount of 3,000 rupees, which is maybe $60 roughly, had worked in a cycle shop, which doesn't sound so bad until you know these are motorcycles. It's filthy, greasy work, not suitable at all for children. Boobalan had worked at a hand loom for another debt of 3,000 rupees. Prabha Harahan had worked in a cycle shop. Others had worked making matches, just cutting sticks into smaller sticks to make the matches. And others worked making beedies, the little hand-rolled cigarettes. Day after day, no education, prevented from going to school, forced to work, and no doubt not just exploited for these ostensible purposes, but for whatever their master wanted to use them for debts that would amount to what some of us might spend on a decent meal out, but debts that for them would never be repaid. This kind of slavery, of course, is illegal in India and in every country in the world. It's one of the glories of our time, that we live in an age when governments have recognized that this is inhuman. And few government officials are eager to admit that it's happening in their country on their watch, but it is happening. The cruel irony is that 2 centuries after the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade by the British Parliament, 150 years after the Union's victory in the American Civil War, more human beings are enslaved today than were trafficked across the Atlantic in the 200 years of chattel slavery in North America. More human beings enslaved right now than were trafficked during that whole 2 centuries of brutality sponsored by our own nation, our own forebears. So it's actually not hard today to meet a slave. There are many to meet. And if you want to understand power at its worst, I suggest you ought to meet a slave. Because enslavement is the worst of power. In enslavement, one human being asserts unlimited power over another. An assertion that requires an inflation and a deflation. An inflation of the slave owner's own power, to unholy, godlike levels of mastery, but also a deflation, the eradication of this other person's power. And in this corrupted version of absolute power, power is a finite resource. The inflation of one comes at the expense of another. For a slave to gain power in this conception would require the master to lose power, which is why full slavery involves not just a claim on the slaves themselves, but on their children. So that in the country where this photograph was taken, often slavery is multi-generational, because to allow slaves to create anything outside the scope of the master's power would be to diminish the master's power, so that the power all accrues to the slave owner, even the capability of procreating a child. For time out of mind, this had been the reality of life in Gudiyatan. But when I met some of these ones whose names are on this list, they were no longer slaves. I took a couple pictures. These were two of the boys who'd worked in motorcycle shops, about the age of my son at that time. He's older now. And then there were these beautiful girls who are the age my daughter is now, about 12 years old. And they all filed into the offices of the local World Vision office, where World Vision had been working for 9 years. What had World Vision been doing during that time? Well, they had started a women's association. If you read very carefully, that list of released slaves was compiled by the Kalangium Women's Federation, something that had never been done before, creating an environment where women could come together, talk about household economics, village economics, start saving money, start going to the bank and depositing money, something they'd never thought to do. World Vision had been working with local village councils to address issues of housing and jobs in this particular district. They'd started a citizenship training program, very interesting thing. Everyone in India is a citizen, but the members of the lower caste, so-called, don't think of themselves as citizens. And so World Vision had started to train them to think of themselves as citizens, to recognize their rights and responsibilities as citizens. And at every step, World Vision had educated the whole community about India's laws against bonded labor, the polite term for what is really, in effect, slavery, and the right of children to go to school. So by the time Jaikumar and I visited, slavery was dramatically reduced in this district. Not gone, but reduced. And these children, who just a couple years before had been working every day, not in school, came in their school uniforms and had lunch with us. And through a translator, I got to ask them a few questions. I got to ask the second girl from the right there, whose name, alas, I do not remember. We'll call her Ganti, since that's one of the names that was on the board. I asked her what she was hoping to do when she finished school, and she had a very quick answer. She said, "I want to become a doctor." She said, "There are no doctors in my village, so I want to train to be a doctor and come back and be the doctor for this village." I was trying to think of what else do you ask a 12-year-old when you've just met? It's awkward here, it's awkward there. I said, "So what do you like to do after school?" And I was thinking maybe play ball, or I don't know. And she said, "My friends and I like to free slaves." And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Well, there are still children in this district working under the system of bonded labor. So what we do is we go to the children who aren't coming to school. And my friends and I go, and every afternoon we find them and we tell them, you should be in school. You have every right to be in school. Your labor master can't keep you here." She said, "And then we go to the slave owners and we tell them, you could get thrown in jail. And you should stop. This is wrong and it's illegal. And if you keep doing it, the police will come and throw you in jail. You can't get away with this anymore." In her spare time, it turns out that this 12-year-old was an abolitionist. First 12-year-old abolitionist I ever met. And you can see that these kids and their parents did not in any way lack for confidence, poise, self-assurance, hope. I sat with this thing they called the Children's Panchayat. The Panchayat is the local unit of government in villages like this. And they had a children's version. It was like the model UN. And we sat around on banana leaves in a clearing in the village. And these children practiced taking responsibility for their village, talked about what they wanted it to be like when they grew up, what they wanted to change, what they wanted to keep the same. And on the train, on the way back home to Chennai, I said to Jaikumar, you have to help me with something. These people are very poor. They were very materially poor. There was not a lot in this village. I said, but Jaikumar, they don't act poor. They don't seem poor. And Jaikumar said two things to me that have pretty literally changed my life. The first thing he said is, Andy, when you see what you think is poverty, when you see someone you think that person looks poor, or this district looks poor, you need to realize that what you're seeing is not actually about lack of money. And it's not even about lack simply of political power or access. He said, when you see what seems like entrenched poverty, it's a sign of just one thing, that someone or some group of people has been playing God in the life of someone or some other group of people. The real root of what you call poverty, Andy, is not money. It's people playing God in the lives of others, the way that those slave owners play God in the lives of the children and families that they ensnare. And then he added something that really has challenged me ever since. He said, do you know my greatest fear about our work at World Vision? It's that we would replace one set of God players with ourselves and keep playing God in the lives of the poor. So that we would replace a malevolent set of God players, these local business owners, slave holders, with our benevolent form of God playing. Come in with all of our technical knowledge and expertise. Come in with our connections to Western donors. Come in with our connections to the Indian government. And simply replace one malevolent set of God players with benevolent God players. And in doing so, perpetuate the very poverty that we're here to relieve. Because only when we stop playing God will these people recognize their own capacity, their own agency, their own human dignity. To play God in the lives of the poor would leave them still poor. I want us to think tonight about the fundamental question that this story and this reality raises for us. This reality of the worst abuses of power happening right now, to some extent even in our own country, and to a broad extent in many places around the world, but also this remarkable story of a whole district where that reality had suddenly changed and was no longer the defining reality. And this story and this reality raise for us very acutely the question of power. And I think this is something we don't talk well enough about. Specifically, I want to talk about a more particular concept, power in general, but I want to talk tonight about authority, which I would simply define, and I'm kind of generally following sociology here, the way that sociologists think of the word authority, that authority is power, the ability to act efficaciously, effectively in the world. It's power plus trust. Authority is trusted power. That's all I intend by it when we talk about authority tonight. It's just power that some group of people places trust in. When someone trusts your power, you have authority. There's other kinds of power that don't come with trust. The bonded labor owners don't have trust, but they have power in that district. But what would a kind of power look like that has trust? Now, I want to distinguish two kinds of authority, and here's where it gets a little technical, and I act like a philosopher, which is a very bad thing to do for many reasons, especially when you're not one. I'm going to use a kind of philosophical shorthand, because I want to distinguish two further kinds of authority. Authority is power plus trust. But if you think about it, there's two ways to think about it. There's a descriptive form, you could say, and a prescriptive form, or a descriptive form and a normative form. And I'm going to call them authority 1 and authority 2. This is what philosophers do when they can't be bothered to think up better names for things. They just call it this 1 and this 2. So authority 1 is just descriptive. That is to say, we can recognize authority 1 when we just see that people trust some person with power. We just empirically observe it, all right? But there would also be a normative version, wouldn't there, where we would say, not only do we see that people do trust this person's power or this form of power, but they ought to trust it. It feels like it's not just trusted, but trustworthy. All right? Do you see the distinction I'm making? Because it's possible to trust in some form of power or authority that really is not trustworthy. I have a relative, I'm going to disguise how close or distant this relative may be, who places great trust in the historical and political insights of Glenn Beck. Well, so I see authority one there. When Glenn Beck speaks, I hear about what Glenn Beck has said about the state of our world from this relative. So this person trusts Glenn Beck, authority one. But in my judgment, Glenn Beck should not be trusted the way that she trusts him. So authority two is missing, even though authority one is present. Last night I got on a plane in the face of an approaching hurricane, and I trusted the pilots to get me from Philadelphia to Detroit Airport. Authority one, empirically, I trusted them. I got here, authority two, they were trustworthy, all right? So the pilots have both authority one and authority two. We've learned to trust at a very high degree of confidence that when pilots say they can get you from one place to another, even though you look out the window and think, I don't think I'd want to fly a plane tonight, they know what they're doing. Another example, a great example, is meteorologists, because meteorologists used to just have authority one. That is to say, they used to have no idea what they were doing. During World War II, I swear this is true because I've read it 3 times on separate places in the internet. The field commanders for the Allies had meteorologists, and they asked them to provide, on a rolling basis, 10-day forecasts for the weather in order to make their plans. And eventually, the meteorologists got so frustrated with this that they came to the generals and they said, our meteorology can only predict maybe 2 days. We have no idea what's going to happen in 10 days. Our forecasts are completely useless. And the reply was, you must keep the forecast coming so that we can continue to plan. All right, so that was authority one. They were trusted, but no authority two for those extended range forecasts. But now, of course, meteorology has advanced to the point where we do have astonishingly reliable, maybe 10 days is still a bit much, but think of how much more we know about a hurricane like Sandy than we would have known even 10 years ago. So authority two has risen for meteorologists, even while all along we were looking at the weather forecast, authority one. First premise of this talk, if you will, is that we can't live without authority. Authority one. There's no way to go through life in the complex kind of world that at least that we live in without entrusting ourselves to other people's power. I think this is just empirically true. I don't think it actually is much of a claim. It's just true. All the time we entrust ourselves to people who claim a certain sphere of capacity, and we entrust ourselves to them. You certainly do it every time you get on an airplane. The second premise of this talk, and it's worded a little differently. I said we can't live without authority one, but I would say we cannot flourish without authority two. There's a difference between living and flourishing. There's a difference between merely existing or eking out life and living a rich, full, abundant life. And I would just suggest to you at this point, maybe I'll convince you, maybe I won't, that the only way human beings flourish in the world, that is, come to life in everything they're meant to be, is if they find sources of authority that are trustworthy. That is, not that they just put their trust in something willy-nilly, because we have to trust in something, but they find something to put their trust in, or a series of somethings or someones that truly can bear the weight of that trust. And it's when we find authorities in this very broad sense, people who have some capacity that we can trust in, that we truly should trust in, that we come alive as human beings. I'm going to try to persuade you of that in the next few minutes. Let's make one more distinction. Let's think about the kind of authority the pilots have, the airplane pilots have. And I would call this technical authority. In the domain of flying an airplane, which is at once extremely complex and in another way extremely simple. It comes down to a few laws of physics, of just a few equations. In this both very simple and highly complex domain, the pilots of my aircraft have almost perfect authority. They can replicate their power and be trusted with their power over a very wide range of conditions over and over, most of them through the course of a whole career, essentially flawlessly. It's quite extraordinary, right? And this is what I would call technical authority. Interestingly, this is mostly what universities now instill in us. That is, they attempt to instill in us, by the way, not just technical authority. One, people will trust you because you have a diploma from the University of Michigan, but authority two, people ought to trust you, right? Now, if you have a diploma from Berkeley University, which is spelled B-E-R-K-L-E-Y, and it exists only on the internet, right? You might be able to get people to give you authority one in some field, right? Say surgery. But you don't have authority two. You're not trustworthy. University of Michigan, on the other hand, if they let you out of here with a diploma in surgery or any other technical field, you not only have authority one, people will trust you in that field to exercise your power faithfully, but you will have authority two. You'll be trustworthy in that domain. But here's the odd thing about technical authority, which probably most of us are acquiring right now or have acquired in some field. Some more useful than others, classics, not so much, surgery, actually quite a lot. But we're all acquiring kind of technical authority. But the interesting thing is, the more precise and reliable technical authority is, for example, the authority to fly an airplane, the less broadly useful it is. The more precisely useful it is, the less broadly useful it is. So think about this. The pilots of my plane could tell me whether or not we could safely fly to Detroit with a very high level of authority. However, they are of almost no use in saying whether I should be going to Detroit or Ann Arbor, right? If I had asked my pilot, now I know you can get me to Detroit and then to Ann Arbor, but should I go? I think the only proper response would be, that is above my pay grade, right? I can't answer that question. They don't have the slightest power to tell me whether I should go to Ann Arbor or not. Very odd to be entrusting myself to these people who know so much about how to do it, but have no idea whether I should do it. And in a nutshell, this is our very particular modern problem, which is that in our society we have greater and greater technical authority. There are more and more domains where we know a great deal about how to exercise power in a trustworthy way, in a way that delivers the results we hope. And less what I want to call ultimate authority. That is, we entrust more and more of our lives to specialists who have real trustworthy power in a technical field, but fewer and fewer of us know where to turn for help with the ultimate questions of life that are ultimately far more important, because much more important than the question of, can I go to Ann Arbor, is the question, should I go to Ann Arbor? Where do I go? What authority do I go to answer not just the technical question, but the ultimate question, should I go to Ann Arbor? So here's the corollary of my first two premises. First, I said we can't live without authority one. We can't live without putting our trust in someone else's power. And I would say that's not just true in the technical sense. I can't fly my own plane. I've got to trust someone else to fly my plane. But in the ultimate sense, I don't think you can live without trusting someone or something else to exercise power in your life by guiding you not just in the how questions, but in the should questions. I think you've got to entrust yourself at some point to some authority to figure out, who am I supposed to be? And even if you say, well, I trust myself, you are actually standing in a very long line of authorities in Western culture. Rousseau, Nietzsche, who have taught you to think that you are a sufficient authority, who have given you that sense of power, who have enabled you to exercise at least authority one in your own life, to trust yourself. You're relying on a much longer story of people explaining that that's a viable path to a good life. But if we can't live without authority one, not just technically, but ultimately, I think it's also true that we can't flourish, that is, we can't become everything we're meant to be, without authority two. That is, not just finding something, anything to trust, but actually finding someone or something that's actually trustworthy.